and specifically about far-right populism in the US and in Europe. Let's start out by asking who votes for these far-right populists. There's what's called the diploma divide between university graduates and those without degrees. I'll call them non-college voters. I'll just focus on the US for now. In 1960, Democrats, the Liberal Party, won non-college voters by 2-1. But in 2020, Joe Biden, the current president, lost non-college voters by 2-1. But by 2020, Republicans won white non-college voters by 34 percentage points. That's a very, very big shift. So why did this happen? The short answer is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is that faith in unfettered markets and free trade with a focus on raising the gross domestic product, the GDP, without much interest in how the new wealth got distributed. That was accompanied by a distrust of government regulation, of antitrust regulation, and of unions. And the result was really what's been called a winner-take-all economy, where a small proportion of the very wealthy population got much, much wealthier. But for most of the population, there was what's called the great risk shift. Risks that had been shouldered by employers were shifted onto the shoulders of workers, so that pensions, health care disappeared along often with full-time work. Neoliberalism definitely empowered workers as consumers, but it did not empower them as workers. And in the decades of the 1990s, pretty much till 2016, it was embraced both by Democrats and by Republicans, with parallel political currents in Europe. Now, it goes without saying, economic populism, it's about economics. Today, the US is the most unequal developed country in the world. What really happened is that middle-class jobs disappeared. Between 1982 and 2017, 1/3 of all routine white and blue-collar jobs disappeared. And the US economy polarized into high-level jobs and low-level jobs. Nearly all of the net growth in employment was in short-term jobs and gig work, what we call irregular work. So the dream of a stable middle-class life disappeared. In the 1990s, wealth was evenly split between Americans with and without college degrees. But in roughly the same period, the college wage premium, the amount more that the average college graduate earned than a non-college graduate, it doubled. A college graduate earned about 40% more at the beginning of this period. Now a college graduate earns on average 80% more than a non-college graduate. And the end result of all of this is an economist, Roz Chetty's work, is that in the decades after World War II, virtually all Americans did better than their parents, over 90%. But for people born in the 1980s, you only have about a 50-50 chance of earning more than your parents. And many people see that as the death of the American dream. Political scientists show that the core of support for far-right populism is people just hanging on to routine white, pink, and blue-collar jobs. It's not the poor, it's the fragile and failing middle class who are voting for the far right. It's driven, political scientists show, by what one calls nostalgic deprivation, the sense of nostalgia, that things used to be better in the past, and that they aren't today. What's called nostalgic deprivation predicts far-right support both in the US and in the UK. In the US, when you look at the sense of being deprived economically, moving from the least to the most, increases support for Trump by 41%. That's a big number. Economic strain predicts Trump voting. There's lots of political science that shows this. One very famous economist, David Autor, documents what he calls the China shock. In congressional districts most exposed to Chinese imports, they veered hard right if they were white, majority white. Interestingly enough, if they were majority people of color, they veered hard left. There were similar effects in Europe. Districts exposed to Chinese imports tend to support the far right. Other studies show that workers who were exposed to automation also veered far right, both in Europe and in the US. So workers who had their jobs lost or threatened by automation, that is. So a big issue in the US isn't MAGA really not Make America Great Again, but Make America White Again? Aren't these voters really nostalgic for white privilege? Well, it's true that white privilege was very much a part of the economic expansion in the United States after World War II. And yet, it's hard to argue that the Trump's MAGA is just about white privilege. Now, people of color vote much more heavily Democratic in the US, but there has been very substantial movement of people of color towards the far right. This shift among people of color makes it harder to argue that MAGA is just about racism. Now, again, it's true that racism is a better predictor of Trump voting than college graduation, but those people who are motivated chiefly by racism, that's not enough votes to win. Trump won because he also attracted votes among a different group of voters who are only moderate in racial resentment. And that's the group we call the anti-elites. There are really two groups of Trump voters who are economically very progressive. They're very left on economic issues. 20% of Trump voters are called the American preservationists. For them, being white and Christian is really important to their identity. And they have the coldest feelings of any group of voters towards people of color. So there's a lot going on there with respect to race. On the other hand, 19% of Trump voters are called the anti-elites. Their feelings towards people of color are as warm as those of non-Trump voters. This group was more supportive of gay marriage, actually, than any other group of voters. They're moderate on climate change, and nearly 70% support higher taxes on the rich. So again, they're very progressive economically. So the challenge for liberals is really to effectively counter far-right populism by appealing to this second group of Trump voters, the anti-elites. The far-right media and far-right politicians have been very analytical about connecting culturally with the culture of non-elites. What the political scientists show is that the far right, their appeal stems from the fact that they they filled what the political scientists call the representation gap. For several decades, both in Europe and the US, voters who were economically liberal but culturally conservative were not represented by either party. So what far-right populists do is they fill that gap. They are economically liberal and culturally conservative. They marry progressive economic policies with conservative social policies. This representation gap existed for decades, both in Europe and the US, and explains the rise of far-right populism and why it's happened in both arenas. So what's an effective strategy? First, you got to get the economics right. Only a quarter of non-college voters believe that Democrats are closest to their views on helping the middle class. 37% think that neither party cares about helping the middle class. Getting economics right and creating good new blue-collar jobs and good regular jobs instead of irregular work, it's really essential, but it's only the first step. Because the far right has learned to bond with these non-college voters through rage at the loss of the American dream. And the counter move is for the left to bond through respect. But that means that the left actually has to respect these non-college voters. It has to do what conservatives like Rush Limbaugh did decades ago, which is to build a cultural connection with non-elites who hold very different values than college-educated elites do. Because what the sociologists tell us is that class, it's expressed through economics for sure, but class is also expressed through cultural differences. Different classes, they have different values, different traditions of talk, different attitude towards tradition itself. This is what I've called the class culture gap, is that non-elites not only value self-discipline, but they value the traditional institutions that aid self-discipline, religion, the military, family values. In both the United States and Europe, those traditional institutions are often seen very condescendingly by elites, and they're very much cherished by non-elites. This is something the right has understood and the left needs to learn. So what MAGA in the United States and the far right also in Europe does is they sculpt class anger into culture wars by weaponizing this class culture gap. Notice how we've been talking about class, we've been talking about race, we haven't been talking about gender at all. Gender very often gets lost in the shuffle. And in this discussion of far-right populism, that's typically what's happened, which is kind of ironic because gender attitudes predict Trump support even better than racism in both men and in women. Now, that doesn't mean that gender is important and race isn't. But what it does mean is that MAGA sculpts class anger into masculinity contests by deftly connecting with working class masculinities. Class-based masculinities play a key role in the far right's appeal. I think one key is to realize that at this point, college-educated elites, they're economically embattled too. Elites are suffering from the anxiety that they won't hold their position in a winner-take-all society, much like non-elites have in the past. One recent New York Times article, actually this was a New York Times Daily, the title of it was, "It Sucks to be 33." The college wage premium has increased, as we heard in a prior lecture, but the college wealth premium has flattened out. In other words, people who graduate from college now are no wealthier than people who never graduated. And that's because college is so expensive that you have so much debt that you end up no wealthier. The high level of debt also means that many younger Americans, and this sounds like Koreans, they're putting off buying homes because they can't afford them. They're putting off having kids because they feel they can't afford them. So the winner-take-all economy means that inequality has risen sharply between the top 1% and the rest of the top 20%. Connect the economic anger of non-elites with the economic anger of college grads who can't afford to buy houses, have kids, and get that stable middle-class life. And then also to help college-educated elites develop the cultural competence so that they know how to talk to people who haven't graduated from college. The only way to stop the rise of far-right populism is to heal the broken relationship between elites and non-elites.